Today, the heart of the matter. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to my latest post covering finance and prop news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And today I'm joined by Tony Locantro from Alto Capital. Hello, Tony.
G'day, Martin. Probably somber times today, I guess.
Well, you know, we've been talking over the last few months about some of the risks in the economy, and of course now we've got the health episode, which is really right there in front of us, and it's creating huge fallouts for the broader economy. And I think it's true to say that we're in uncharted territory.
Well, yeah, absolutely. There's no precedent for what we're seeing. And a lot of your scenarios you've discussed, and a lot of what I've discussed, having involved a deleveraging event, but at a much gentler pace. So I liken this to a plane trying to land being hit by a microburst. And, I've watched a bit of air crash investigations, and the plane just hits the ground. So you've got everyone in the world with access to media worried, people that are getting cabin fever. I see they've allocated $1.1 billion for domestic violence and mental telehealth. I don't think that's going to work, to be honest. I think a lot of women living with psychopaths and reverse are going to need access to shelters, not a Skype session. And I think the mental health issue is going to involve, you've got to do more than simply talk to people on Skype, sadly, as long as people can get access to all their medication. But, I mean, this is all a little bit too little, too late, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we did a show last year on the DFA channel and with John Adams as well, looking at Mandra, right? And there we sort of said, look, Mandra is an example of what happens when society effectively goes a bit wrong and house prices drop, but you also have all of the issues of, social disquiet and, even the druggies and those sorts of things. And I said at that point, I just hope we never see similar conditions down the East Coast that effectively we've seen down the West Coast. But unfortunately, what I'm seeing now from my surveys, with the amount of unemployment that's there, with the amount of cash flow freeze that's there, both in household budgets and businesses, there's only one way this can go, and it's not good.
It's very, very ugly scenario, and I've been giving it some thought as to how long the bored youth can hang on during this. I know I've been inside. I go out and get half an hour of fresh air a day. I go and drive. How long can kids that want to form a club can stay sane, basically? I can just see massive social unrest happening. You've got all the shops are closed. I think you're going to start to see looting, violence. Tomorrow I'm going to up my home and contents insurance. I don't know. I worked in the Redfern police riots of '94, and we were up against the Indigenous people, and they were angry. But they were throwing bricks and bottles at us, and you had time to dodge it. But I could just see the anger, and then you had the Cronulla race riots as well. So we haven't seen anything yet. And those that are thinking this can't happen in Australia, well, who would have thought you would have seen companies like Flight Centre, Webjet, Myer, David Jones virtually decimated so quickly? And the other point is, Martin, the stock market dropped 37% from the peak in no time. The all-time high in the Australian stock market, I think it was the Dow, was February the 20th. I mean, we're only at March 29. So I'm going to say to people, you're going to see shit in Australia you never thought possible. And I've dealt with that social unrest on a limited scale as a police officer. Admittedly, in those days, I only carried a bat and handcuffs and a gun. These days, they look like G.I. Joe. But you can see the people spitting at police officers. I can just see some huge crime gangs emerging. And sadly, those birthday party drive-bys, if we don't stop this soon, it's going to translate to drive-by shootings. And I'm really concerned about the social impacts because we've had the economic thud. So I don't want to see anyone threatened for their safety. I don't want to see my family threatened because I know what's happening. And I see this shock of losing one's job is going to take more time to settle in than what we're seeing at the moment. So I think people are probably in shock at the moment. Then they have to deal with it. And I know I wake up every day thinking, was that a nightmare?
Mm. Well, it's actually, if you put it into a movie, I mean, there have been a number of movies, of course, in the past of global catastrophes and stuff. You'd almost think this is way too off the scale, right? Because the sheer fallout globally, from the financial fallout and socially, but every country in the world is pretty much wrestling with the same issues at the very same time. And if you go back to 100 years plus ago, the depression there were areas that really didn't feel it very much, whereas this is a global thing. So whatever we think about locally and the issues here, in the context of global, this is just a remarkable turnaround that's happened very quickly. And whilst all the central banks have thrown liquidity at it to try and cushion the soft landing or whatever it's going to be, it seems to me that this is quite awkward now and very difficult. And I also think, and I've had a lot of people reach for me, people who've been following me for some time, saying, well, I'm afraid you were right, wish you hadn't been, but you're right. So what do we do? And I said, well, it's almost a bit late now, because essentially if you've still got massive amounts of debt there and you're reliant on two incomes to service that debt, you might be able to get some latitude from the banks in the short term. But if you don't have a job, shortly and down the track, that's not going to be able to solve the problem into the longer term. So it really is getting very, very difficult now.
Yeah, I think you've got to have your health first. I'm pretty much practicing social isolation at the moment. I've got a family to look after. I sent my 16-year-old son into Woolworths. He's aware of that because I know it's taking a capitalist approach, but I've got 200 people to look after. 200 people that are doing it tough, 200 people that need to know that their money they've invested. Oh, sure, it's hard, Martin. I can't hide from it. I mean, what's happened is we've had a liquidity event and everyone's been in illiquid assets. You look at super funds that now have to reprice their unlisted assets. They can't sell them. Unfortunately, this quite hurts. I actually sat down and looked at my repricing model for the Sydney median house price. It was at $640,000. I've discounted that another 25% to arrive at $480,000. And the really sad part is that based on where our economy is heading, that still could be too expensive. And I see some stupid tweets from people saying, look, if we just shut off the property market, there's going to be no sales. Well, you can't leave the stock market closed. The stock market's open for 6 painful hours and we gyrate according to the Dow futures, and companies are allowed to drop from $40 to below 10. That's a free market. Unfortunately, I am all for having the government support someone in their primary place of residence, but those with multiple properties, that's speculation. Shit happens. I mean, I fund biotech companies that are looking to help unmet clinical needs. I've had mine cut in half. I don't expect a bailout. I'm a speculator. Shit happens. There's always going to be a risk. There's always the Dow going to crash. But who would have thought we would have got a global pandemic as well? And I'm a bit of a deep thinker, which hurts at times. But I'm thinking, how can we get it? How can we rely on people now who got it so wrong leading up to this, saying that there's no bubble in housing, 190% debt to income isn't an issue? And how can we have airport security where you go through all these checks, then you can buy anything before you get on a plane to bring a plane down? It just, I know that's a lame thought, but it's stupid, and we're relying on these people. So the way I see it happening is, let's just say 2 million people lose their jobs, sadly. Then companies are going to come back and they're going to cut out a lot of jobs, which are going to be unnecessary. And we come back with a much leaner economy where 3 out of 5 say only get the jobs back. So what are we going to do with the long-term unemployed? So there's the other problem. And we're back to a basics economy where assets are priced relative to wages and growth. And to me, sadly, that means a peak to trough correction in some property markets of 60% plus, and that's the reality. And that's the reality I've seen on the stock market, where companies have been poleaxed in days. Property isn't immune, but we can take measures to look after families that have no other option. But those with 25 properties, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's very interesting. There's 2 points to make there. Did you see that the UK have closed down the property market? So basically the banks lobbied the government and basically said, look, we can't allow the property market to continue because prices will fall and that will hurt our balance sheets. So close the property market down. And by the way, that will keep social isolation high. But understand it was driven by the banks who were concerned about the impact of their balance sheet, right? Now, my argument there is, well, you can close the property market down for a certain period of time. But at some point, you've got to open up the market again, right? And guess what will happen on day one when the market's open again? Prices will just drop through the floor. So in a way, what you're doing is you're just storing up a problem for later, right? The other point to make is in my scenarios, as you may know, my scenarios run, the worst case scenario is an 80% drop in property prices. And up until quite recently, I gave that a relatively low probability. But I have to say that the probabilities of, a 40% correction is very high, but the higher levels of drops now look absolutely on the cards. And that's the concern. So, this is going to be really painful. And you're quite right. You can't expect, if you're a property investor with multiple properties, that you've taken those risks. You were a speculator on the way up and you're a speculator on the way down. I guess if you've got a single property and it's where you live, there should be more support from the government. And I'm personally ever believing that we should be actually getting support from the government for some degree of income support for households to enable them to get through this hiatus period, right? I'm also concerned that the hiatus period is longer than it might be because the amount of pressure and tightening of the economy isn't as much as we need. So I think we have to tighten quicker to allow the battle with the health issue to be solved quicker, and then we can start thinking about recovery. But the recovery will not be a V-shaped recovery. This is going to be a long, slow grind up later. And as you said, the economy will be very different post.
Reverse leverage is a bitch, isn't it?
Yeah. And unfortunately, the more properties you've got, the more leverage you've got, the more you win on the way up, the more you lose on the way down.
But it's like an addiction for them. So, yeah. So, I know you look at those examples, but I look at somewhere like El Salvador that has shut their borders down quickly, then gave everyone 3 months hibernation. I mean, we've been terribly slow in this.
Yeah. No, we have. And it's, because they've got this on one scale, they've got economy here, health issue here, right? And they're sort of twiddling the knob to try and find some optimal point between the two. But the point is, unless you deal with the health issue properly and completely, you'll never get the economy back. So what we should be doing is focusing all our efforts on dealing with the health issue and getting that fixed so that then we can actually begin to bring the economy back. And that means tighter controls for a short period. Trying to play somewhere in the middle loosey-goosey is just going to make this go on for a much longer period of time, and actually will have bigger consequences on the economy because more companies will just fall over.
Exactly. And I look at how even China's handled it. South Korea have handled this. South American countries, as I mentioned, have done extremely well in containing it. And you've got Spain, Italy, and the US, which have had terrible statistics, and we're not looking much better. But you're absolutely right. If we let's just have a total lockdown. Let's just get it out of the way. Everyone should have a chance to stock up. Obviously, you're going to have to give greater powers to the police, greater powers to the army, because this half-assed approach is not going to work. And you've got to look at all these people losing their jobs. Now, that's really cut into retail at the moment. But what about the bigger corporations with the workers with bigger mortgages as well? So, and I'm sure couples at the moment are probably sitting down to dinner or a cup of coffee and thinking, we need to sell the house. Sadly, there's too many people doing that. And what I've noticed in some of my stocks, Martin, to use a stock analogy, I'm hoping people don't sell, but I can't stop them. I've got to accept the 40 to 50% price falls in the stocks temporarily. The same if two people in your street sell a house due to distress, you're not going to get $200,000 more. But my question is, to you, Martin, once we get to that $485,000, $500,000 median, where does all the debt go?
Yeah. Well,
how are we going to wash away that debt?
Yep.
And it's going to happen so quickly.
Yeah. Well, Tony, my view is this: that there'll be a choice, and essentially either you leave the debt where it is and basically let the market rip, and which means a lot of people will be out on their ear ultimately, or you go through a process of what I call debt restructuring, which essentially drops the value of the debt to mirror the drop in prices to get back to a more normal level. And there are ways of doing that, partly through government support. There's a thing called the Chicago Plan, which was put out initially in the 1930s, but actually has been refreshed about 10 years ago. The IMF actually put some papers out on it. And basically what they said is, the trouble is that our banks have actually got too big for their boots. They're doing too much of the mortgage stuff. They're not doing enough of the business support stuff. And effectively, the Chicago Plan is one way where you effectively reconfigure the banking system to be able to get rid of all that excess debt, get the banks to focus on supporting businesses rather than just inflating property prices. And people essentially will see the value of their properties drop, but also the debt go down too, to a more appropriate level. That is a major adjustment, though, and that needs to be done not just in one country, it needs to be done in multiple countries to have the effect. Otherwise, you just blow the exchange rate. Unless you go somewhere there, the other alternative is simply many people being forced to sell into falling markets, losing their shirts, going bankrupt, and effectively that debt having to be written off. And that would, of course, would have just as much impact on the banking system. And I also think that central bankers, they should be held accountable for their stupidity over the last 20 years and particularly over the last 10 years, because they've been focusing on the financial stability of the financial system rather than the real issues in the real economy. And I'm afraid that they've been found absolutely wanting.
Yeah, I think a lot of us are in that situation, and people suddenly realise that what's a necessity and what is a want, because now, my greatest want is half an hour to an hour of exercise a day, not around people, a nice cup of coffee, and family. I've got a heap of size 41 shirts in the cupboard. They're not going to fit me at the end of this, so I've got to go out and buy a new wardrobe. But looking at some aspects of society, I guess if you take on a job as a writer, an artist, or you want to do TV commercials, you're essentially unemployed. But I look at the young AFL and NRL stars that have been on lucrative contracts that are now taking pay cuts. Some of them would have huge mortgages. A smaller percentage would have gambling cash flow issues, as we know. But I think if you're going to target mental health, look towards those young people. People might say, oh, they're football stars. They get all the women. They've got all the groupies all after them. But I just think that that's where the mental issues are going to come from someone so young, earning so much money, suddenly slapped in the face. And it's a king hit. So I look, you've got to target your mental health service towards those people that are likely going to need it, not people that simply require more medication and some reassurance. Because, you look at people, Virgin flight attendants, that young lady on the plane crying. To me, that's the true angst of what we're going through.
Yeah, well, there's going to be a lot more of that. And I also think we need to be thinking about kids, right? Because kids are seeing the world that they thought was there effectively disappearing in front of them, and they're now in a very different world. Experience shows that down the track, that also has a penalty later, because effectively the safe, secure environment that people want to bring their kids up in maybe not there, and therefore I think there are some big issues that we've got to think structurally about how we provide the right levels of support. And you're right, it's pretty broad across the community. I've got so many emails from people saying, help, what do I do? And it really is very sad, because there's not a lot that we can do, because this is just so big and so complex. I also think that this is the end of consumerism as we've known it. And if you
Well,
think,
I think we called that at the peak of Afterpay's share price, and when debt to income got to around 200%, which is ludicrous. I mean, my 16-year-old son had his pre-apprenticeship cancelled. Prior to the COVID, he applied for at least 100 jobs and got a response rate of 2%. So I've said to him, as much as it hurts me as a father, I said, you're stuffed for now. Let's just enjoy life. I'm teaching him how to drive. That's my escape. Let's do it. Because now, suddenly, to get a job at Woolworths, he's up against Qantas employees.
yep,
So people that have come from decent jobs being paid a bit less, but all the jobs are going. Domino's are employing. A lot of the people in Domino's might have had their hours cut. So the competition for limited jobs is going to be immense. And instead of having 5.2, 5.3 unemployment, which I think is a load of shit anyway, because our underemployment is an absolute joke.
yep.
It's going to be tough, and we're going to have to support the long-term unemployed. I want what's best for my kids, but he's in a tough spot. My daughter's studying law. She's going to stick with that, but she's going through the KFC management program. I said, you stick with that, because to me, a job like that, even if that's your best case, is still a fantastic career. And all this, it's going to be a depression of abundance. I mean, you're going to have to do curbside cleanups. I mean, in the Great Depression, they lined up for soup and sustenance. Now we're just going to have to throw all our rubbish out. And I don't know, we've said it before, prior. The best time to sell all your stuff on Gumtree is when no one else is doing it. Sandbag your economy, sandbag your own personal situation. But now this is just out of hand. And how are we going to deal with a global repricing of assets? That's what we're going through as a result of a health crisis. And you're absolutely right. If I can't afford to get sick, a lot of us cannot afford to get it. And I went for a drive up the northern suburbs of Perth yesterday along the coast, and I was absolutely horrified at how people were living. Just no social distancing, nothing. The owner of a coffee shop in North Beach had to close out of disgust, saying this is totally un-Australian. And you hear all this bullshit about how the Australian spirit and the bushfires where we donate. We've acted like children in this case, absolute children, and it's an embarrassment.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, we've seen the same here locally. The local beaches were still quite full, and they've had to close more beaches because people just don't get it. And, we're socially isolating here because my wife has her illness, which, of course, is a breathing-related illness. So she is very high risk. So we are deliberately being very cautious. And she's just so frustrated because she really can't go out at all, and we just walk down the street and that's about it because she needs a bit of exercise, but that's it. So this is a very, very different environment. I guess the other thing, and this is where I sort of come back to, where is this all going? Clearly bankers and central bankers and politicians and a whole bunch of people who are, have driven the economy in a particular direction for a long time, they should be held accountable for some of this stuff. But there is also a little glimmer on the other side. If we can actually get through this and hopefully deal with the health issues first, there is a chance to lay the foundations for a much more productive and effective economy later. It'll be a long, slow journey. But then the question is, do we have the right leadership to be able to make that work? Because that sort of economy needs to be crafted, I think, on a more carbon neutral basis. It needs to be more local rather than global. The global supply chains have really blown up through this. It needs to be less financialized. It needs to be more real productive stuff. So there's a few parameters that you can begin to start thinking could take us ultimately to somewhere quite interesting. The journey will be really tough. It'll be really painful on the way, but that's got to be the way to think about it, I think, because I think the next 6 to 12 months, whichever way you look at it, is going to be a horror.
Yeah, I think capitalism is great till everyone wants socialism. I think it is, isn't it? Everyone's had this run where you can use cheap money to make lots of money. You can, have 2 European SUVs in the driveway. You can have 3 kids at private schools, 80 grand a year after tax. And now suddenly everyone just wants food, shelter, and freedom of debt.
Yep.
Yeah, capitalism, it's fantastic till it isn't. And unfortunately, it's been caught out by this terrible health crisis. And people say, well, V-shaped recovery. I can't see that. I think stock markets are going to grind lower for some time. The economy is going to be in a tough spot. I just think the job cuts are only just starting. And they came with a thud. You can close, even once you start to reopen retail, you're still going to require less staff. So I think we're heading back to a 70s style lifestyle, hopefully with not the rampant stagflation, which was an issue, Martin, as well, because we're going to have inflation into a recession. You've had people that have questioned the value of gold and silver. Well, gold and silver are doing their job. They've maintained their purchasing power. And it's, certainly interesting, but I think we're going to go back to, I call it the meat and potatoes economy, rather than, music's going back to guitar, bass and drums, not this electronic garbage kids drug themselves out to. Well, some of them anyway. I've got to be careful with my language. I've actually got to call people housos instead of bogans. I don't want to offend anyone. I'm just here to tell it how it is.
Yeah, well, you always do, Tony, which is why I like talking with you, because people get the full unvarnished, as they say. But on that front, we should also just make a point about all those economists who keep saying, "Oh, look, it's minor, small." They're slowly getting on the plan. They're slowly beginning to recognise that the unemployment rate will be rising. But still, many of them are fundamentally still too optimistic, I think, about what's going to happen. And did you notice the Real Estate Institute, who basically said, yeah, we need to actually get some government support to those who are renting, but the support should go to the real estate agents rather than directly to the renters. There are so many people, big companies too, all reaching out and saying, help us, help us, help us, right? And in so many cases, what they did was essentially build a business that was probably a bit fragile, based on this financialization, based on this ever rising home price, based on quite often share prices being inflated by share buybacks and very cheap capital. It's all gone haywire. And my view is, if you expect the government to bail out all of the big end of town, then they probably might, like in the US, but that's not the right way to do it. What we should be doing is focusing the support for real households and real businesses to help get through the next few months.
Yeah, I was reading a little bit up on Airbnb, people that would rent 15 places and use the arbitrage to make money. To me, that's pure greed. You're not doing a service to anyone. I mean, that's just like speculating on garbage. And to me, these models have been found out. You've got other models like the travel industry. Well, that's something we need to save, but not this rampant speculation. And if you watch The Big Short, they say one of the key elements of mania is fraud, and it's all being found out now. But yes, we're going to get back to a less is more economy, and it's going to be painful. But as long as we've got our health and we've got the basics, people realise you don't need all this fancy stuff to be happy. And sadly, we're going to have rising mental health issues, rising domestic violence, and we're going to have no-go zones in Sydney. Once, tranquil, artificially created lakes and suburbs of McMansions are going to become no-go zones dominated by gangs, because you have gangs in any environment, and this is probably the worst one for it, to fester it. So it's going to be an absolute shitstorm. Yeah,
I fear you're right, Tony, unfortunately. And, there's not a lot more that we can actually say other than that the unknowns are huge. This is not going to get fixed anytime quickly. And the social consequences and fallout, both financially and socially, are huge. And I'm really not sure whether our politicians get it yet in terms of just what's ahead, nor indeed I think many of the official brigade. But anybody who takes an objective view, as you and I do, on what's going on, can see the writing on the wall.
Yeah, well, you've got a couple of options. You go full lockdown now. Let's get this thing eradicated. We can keep going with this half-assed turn the knob approach, which gets you nowhere. Or you can do something really stupid like Trump's intimated, build massive hospitals and just get on with life and let people die. So what would you rather have? Let's just get this bloody lockdown over and done with. We're all getting used to being socially distanced, isolated. Let's just get the bloody thing over and done with. And that's it, because we're saving. This is about humanity. This is being, they overuse the word hero, but shit, we can do this. And I'm an optimist. I'm optimistic that we'll get through it. The economy will still have opportunities for people. If you're going to be in a field that's at risk, be the best at what you do. But there's just not going to be jobs for everyone. People just shaking or saying hello to people at the start of a business or in a bank concierge. I mean, those jobs have got to go. And being paid over 100 grand to hold a stop sign and a hose, ridiculous. I read an article about the lollipop economy in the AFR. Absolutely spot on. And we've got all this excess in the economy to remove. And sadly, you've got people that are over leveraged. And why should people that are investing in property be bailed out when in stock market investors just get absolutely king hit? And we've been king hit for the last couple of weeks. And it's now, my days are 6 hours on the market, and they're bloody long, Martin.
Yeah, no, I know. There's nothing worse than just keep watching it going down and down, and then of course you get the little, in a bear market, you get the occasional day when it picks up again, and suddenly everyone says, we've hit the bottom. And a lot of people in the US are saying we've hit the bottom, and then of course it went down again. So, look, Tony, we'll keep in touch over the next while. I think there'll be some important conversations to have as this shakes out. But I think the main message that we're both wanting to leave with our viewers today is we should be pushing for the government to really turn that ratchet hard up, lock down the economy, fight the virus as the number one enemy, and essentially deal with the fallout subsequent. Because if you try and balance the two, then this is just going to go on and on and on, and the risk is that the thing comes back later, and then we just have to go around the houses again.
Yeah, couldn't agree more, Martin. I know it's probably our least optimistic chat, but thanks. You've been doing a fantastic service, and I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for your time today, Tony. Keep safe, and to your family too, and we'll catch up again down the track.